Want some?
Let me know when it's good.
Okay.
Wait, not yet. I'm not starting it.
Yeah, so why don't you try to answer? Yeah, I like the fact that it's more
Have you been investing or just like holding?
Well, I did put some money into both Bitcoin and Ethereum. Probably not the best time. But again, because I'm in ideological sense, and I work at it, and I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm not stressing about that. But I thought about like trying to make some use of it, but currently I'm just holding because I like
Could you share the
using
using
not keeping myself out of it. I've been building a little database to keep all my investments, whether it be like regular stocks, different coins, different index funds. I already went out almost also. I can see one place to use something like Quicken. I'm building something myself. So I've been spending a ton of time doing that instead of thinking about, oh, should I sell now? I'm like, oh, what's the value right now? Like, so I'm like, oh, it dropped a bunch today, but fuck, I still have to, why is the number not right? I know the number says this on the website, but not, it says something different where I'm trying to look at it. And so like, I'm not even paying attention to the values, I'm just so focused on trying to look at operations.
That's good. That's good. It's probably not a good idea. Like I freaked out about value for like, like 3 months after I bought it, and then I was just like deep breath. Like you just gotta let this one ride.
I'm excited about the prospect that she's on teachers a lot, and a lot of these exchanges offer APIs.
Yeah, that's great. That's good. Whatever. Sounds like great. I mean, it sounds like fun. I understand that because I've never really thought of like I could come up with a good like algorithm to trade on, right? But I think that there's probably like some weird patterns, and, like even though like everybody's like it's just good to figure out like something that you aren't looking at, you know, right? Like correlate like two weird pieces of data or pieces of data from different places that not one person is looking at, stuff like that.
Yeah. So I haven't gotten too far between work and trying to have a life. Just learning about the landscape.
I gave up on the life thing a long time ago. Yeah, it's
That's an area.
Okay, we're gonna get started in a couple minutes, and yeah, can I get a show of hands for who here is a Berkeley student? Cool, very cool. I see
take
some.
that whole finger shirt.
Alumni?
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, Casey's an alumni, and if you guys did not know, which I hope you do, we're Blockchain at Berkeley R&D. We're the group hosting the event, and Casey was nice enough to be our presenter for the evening, so he can introduce himself if he wants to. Yeah. So I guess we can just go ahead and start.
Cool, awesome. Thanks everybody for coming. It's really cool to see a bunch of people here for this like kind of niche technical topic, you know. So yeah, it's really awesome. I'll have you know this is the highest quality version of the Boromir meme in existence. I did this especially for you, so be appreciative. So I guess the first thing I'm curious about is how many people would like say that they understand Bitcoin on like a deep kind of technical level? Okay. How many people have been following the current scaling debate and like kerfluffle? Okay, cool, some people. Yeah, so I guess let's get started. One thing is please feel free to ask questions. So I have like a whole bunch of slides, probably like, holy shit, 2 out of 90. But ultimately, if I don't get to them, that's not really important, but probably probably answering the questions that you have is probably one of the most valuable things that I could do. So I don't mind being interrupted, even and like just raise your hand, or if I don't see you, say something, and don't be afraid to ask new questions. We were all born noobs. That's the deep thought. Okay, so agenda. Who I am on the politics of the scaling debate. A lot on the technicals, so sort of the technical aspects of scaling Bitcoin, transaction malleability, which is like this weird thing that SegWit solves, SegWit itself, and then the sort of two events which are coming up in the next couple months, and then a sort of timeline, my own predictions, and just best practices for keeping your Bitcoin safe, if any, during the coming months. So let's see, I'm Casey, Berkeley Computer Science 09, cryptocurrency fanatic since 2013. I wish I was a cryptocurrency fanatic since like 2011, but I'd be like on a beach somewhere. I have worked at various places. I worked at Google, not on Bitcoin stuff. I worked at Facebook, not on Bitcoin stuff. But I did work at a place called Chaincode Labs. Chaincode Labs doesn't get mentioned a lot, but it's one of the companies that sort of hires core devs to do the basic work that needs to be done on Bitcoin Core, which is the main implementation of Bitcoin. I was there for about 6 months. Even when I got there, and this was in 2015, the scaling debate was already going back then, and everybody who was involved was already completely sick of it. So like over 2 years ago, everybody was like, oh my God, let's get over this. I feel like the politics of the scaling debate are kind of like the elephant in the room during this talk. This is a technical issue. It's become hugely political. People on both sides hate each other. Researching it has been like a black hole. Like I've gone onto like the various subreddits and like Slacks, and like people have been, there's crazy propaganda. Everybody is using language in a way to like spin their position. So with that being said, I do have my own opinions about what is the right way to scale Bitcoin. So I can't really like keep those out of this talk, right? But I'll try to keep it as factual as possible, and my opinions will come in when you hear me talk about like the benefits of SegWit or what's not good about SegWit. Okay, cool. So let's start with some background on scaling Bitcoin. The current block size limit is 1 million bytes. So that's a little bit of data in the block header and a whole bunch of transactions. Okay? That's where that data comes from. The block size limit limits the amount of transactions that can be processed. So on average, one block will be found every 10 minutes. And so that means that you can only have 1 megabyte of transactions every 10 minutes. So this means that currently Bitcoin can process about 2 to 7 transactions per second, which is a relatively small number. People talk about 7 transactions per second. That's actually under like highly idealized circumstances. So if they're all very, very small transactions, 7 transactions per second. But 2 to 3 transactions per second is a bit more realistic. So I tried to research like when the block size was introduced, and it was actually really interesting because it was introduced with absolutely no even mention that it was being put into Bitcoin. It was introduced by Satoshi in 2010. Satoshi Nakamoto, the original pseudonymous developer of Bitcoin. He was doing release notes at that time in like forum posts, and there was no mention of it in the release notes. And so it's really hard to say why he put it in there. I think probably his thinking was just to protect the network against a attacker mining one or a series of very large blocks. So blocks, like 10 or 20 or 50 megabyte blocks that would take a long time for the network to process and catch up to. We currently started hitting the limit around October 2016. That's about the time when blocks started hitting that 1 megabyte limit. Yeah, any questions? Cool. So the first question to ask is, why not just jack the block size up? If Bitcoin can only process 2 transactions per second, if we made the block size twice as big, it could process 4 transactions per second. So one issue is increased block latency. So I have like limited whiteboard space, but I'll do my best. Oh, wait, there we go. So the Bitcoin network is a peer-to-peer network. Nodes sort of like connect to each other at random. And so each one of these circles might be a miner or it might be a user. And if this is a miner, when they find a new, well, okay, so Bitcoin has a blockchain. So these blocks that are found every 10 minutes, I don't know what the best way to describe this is, but basically blocks are found every 10 minutes. The blocks contain a whole bunch of transactions, and each Bitcoin node is configured so that it thinks, if it sees 2 blocks, it will think that the longest one is the current valid block. So it'll ignore any short blocks. So that means that if a miner finds this block, but then another miner finds another block at the same height, and then this block gets extended. Let's say that this is like found by miner X, and then this block gets extended with one more block. Then that means that this block will be ignored by other nodes. It will just effectively cease to exist because this block is longer, so it wins. So that means that it's important that blocks. Oh yeah, go for it.
So if I say I'm a malicious actor, do I, in order to do that, would I have to modify my implementation of Bitcoin in such a way that I could work on a shorter block, such that I could make A longer instead?
Yeah. So if you wanted to mine blocks in secret, or for some reason mine a shorter chain, you could just configure your node to do that. But like you would have to have some additional attack or strategy on top of that to make money, because it's likely that your blocks would just be ignored because all the other nodes are out there extending the longer chain.
And as another question, kind of related, my understanding is that miners confirm transactions by making blocks, and nodes verify that those blocks are valid.
Yeah, I mean, so all nodes, including miners, follow the same rules. The role of the miners, the same validity rules. So the miners don't, like you said, the miners don't decide what's valid. Everybody decides what's valid. So the miner's role is just to collect transactions and put them into a block so that we can sort of establish an order to transaction history.
I guess what I'm getting at is, like, what's the incentive for me to run a full node? Is there any incentive, at least in the Bitcoin protocol, for me to run a full node?
Oh, I mean, if you want to know the state of the network, there's an incentive to run a full node. Like if you don't want to trust some other service that, you know, we're at this block, these transactions have been confirmed, these transactions are still waiting to be confirmed. If you want to know that firsthand, you can do that by running a full node. And I think that is kind of an important property of the system. So the property that even if you don't choose to run a full node, you could, and you would get the same result as all the block explorers, I think is important. So I'm a developer. I've been interested in Bitcoin for a long time. I'd probably run a full node, you know, for a total of like 2 or 3 hours, right? But that's really important for like the way that I understand and feel about this protocol, right? It's not like a question of like, trust me, this is correct. It's a question of like, you know, you can get out there, you can do it, right? It's not hard to run a full node. Any one of you could, and thus make and send transactions directly and understand the state of the network. Yeah, so I think the ability to run a full node is important, and the incentive, like I said, is to, you know, if you want to provide some sort of service on top of Bitcoin, or you want to participate in the network directly, then you run a full node.
So if we do increase the block, like if the block size was increased, it becomes harder to mine or harder to process those nodes?
Yes, definitely. So, there's a few things that get harder. So one thing is that in order to run a full node, the other thing that's flying around this network aside from blocks is transactions. Whenever a new transaction is made, the node that originates it will send it to all of its peers because they haven't seen it yet. And they need to decide very quickly if that transaction is valid or not. So one thing that you need to do is you need to keep this thing called the unspent transaction output set in memory. So the unspent transaction output set, also called the UTXO set, is basically the set of transactions that are waiting to be spent. The transactions that, if a transaction came in spending it and it had the correct signature, I would be like, cool, that's a valid transaction. So the fact that you need to keep the fact that you need to be able to consult this set very quickly means that you have to keep it running in memory. So that's one of the resources that a full node consumes in order to be a full node.
So I don't know, I remember reading this somewhere that the unspent transaction output was actually computed on the fly as opposed to like stored somewhere like static.
Yes. Yeah, so it's important to note that if you look at the actual data that nodes send each other and the actual data of the blockchain, the UTXO set is not in there. It's not like you can't be like, okay, in this block, this part is the UTXO set. It's basically, it's something that the nodes compute so that at every block, they remove the transactions that have been spent and add the transactions that now could be spent. And that's the current UTXO. They like keep track of it.
And when you say they compute it, who is they in this?
Full nodes.
Full nodes.
Yeah, no, it's full nodes. And also, full nodes means miners, users, exchanges, everybody who wants to like participate directly in the network.
It's just a way to speed up the transaction.
So
to know which transactions are that.
yes, you need to have this. So you could not have the UTXO set. A transaction comes in, and you like start from the Genesis block, and you like go like to the present day, but that would be very slow. So in practice, all nodes have to keep it in memory. Yeah.
What happens to these transactions that are ignored on like the shorter?
Oh yeah, so actually the interesting thing is that probably this block and this block will contain a lot of the same transactions. Because the miner that was mining this block and the miner that was mining this block, they're in the same network, and so they've probably seen the same transactions recently. So they would have included the same transactions. So this block might contain a lot of the transactions that were in this block. If any transactions were not in this block, they might be in this block, but basically it doesn't matter. It's not like a transaction that's like one chance to get into a block, and then if that block gets reorged out, so a longer chain defeating a shorter chain is called a reorg or reorganization. Yeah, and if that was like the only block that it was in, the miner will just like include them in the next block. Cool. Okay, so we got a little bit ahead of ourselves with the UTXO set, but which we'll come back to. But this is just block latency. So as blocks are found, they get transmitted around the network. And if they're bigger, they'll take longer to go out of the network. So if you're a miner, you don't want to be in the scenario where, let's say you're in this situation. This block has been found by some other miner and is making its way through the network. But you haven't seen it yet. So you're sitting, mining on this old block. All the work you do while you're mining on this block is probably wasted because other nodes will have seen this block. And in fact, you'll see this block soon. And if you found a block then, most nodes would probably ignore it. This block has been seen by more nodes in the network. So if this is height 0 and this is height 1, and you find a block on top of this, you'll say, hey, I found a new height 1 block. And all the other nodes will be like, cool story, bro. I already have a height 1 block. So the hashing power that the miner spends trying to find a block on top of a stale block does not contribute to the security of the network. So if you increase the block size and thus increase the amount of time it takes to spread throughout the network, that will increase the percentage of time that miners spend mining on top of invalid blocks, simply because they won't have seen the new block. So that's what I mean when I say block latency. And one sort of bad effect of this block latency is that miners will try to minimize block latency, which means that they'll all cluster together where they can be close to each other on the network. So this is kind of bad because it means, oh yeah, go for it.
Does what you're describing only apply under a proof of work paradigm?
Proof of stake is like so complicated, and there's like a zillion different like versions of it. So I don't want to like say anything too specific, but yeah, one of the hypothetical advantages of proof of stake is, which I'm very skeptical of because it's very complicated. People are trying very hard to get it right, but I don't want to like badmouth it. But one of the advantages of proof of stake is that people are just sort of like delegated to mine blocks. So you always know who's going to mine the next block. There's no like race to mine a block. But yeah. Cool. So it incentivizes miners to be closer together on the network. Oh yeah, and the other thing is that when a miner like mines on a stale block or finds a stale block that isn't accepted, they don't get paid for it. So not only does that hash power not secure the network, but they lose money. So that means that miners will all try to be closer together on the network. And this is bad for two reasons. So one is that naturally they're all going to gravitate towards places where they can get really high-speed connections, which means like data centers, sort of centralized locations. That kind of makes the network fragile and like easy to attack. Another is that they'll all try to be close to each other, and this probably means that they'll be clustered in like one country or a few countries together, which is like kind of bad. We kind of want Bitcoin to be like some kind of awful hydra that you can't chop its head off because heads are growing out everywhere. And the other thing is that there's it's really interesting. So basically China is has good connectivity within China, but relatively poor connectivity outside of China. And so Chinese miners have a big advantage just because of cheap electricity and access to newly manufactured Bitcoin mining hardware. So that means that naturally there's lots of miners in China. However, the poor connectivity between China and the rest of the world and this block latency issue means that just because miners are there, or lots of miners are there, it means more miners will want to be there. And again, that's just bad for centralization, right? We don't want the Chinese government, not that I think that the Chinese government is more likely than any other government to do anything about it, but we don't want the Chinese government to be like, all right, like, no more Bitcoin in China, or like, you know, something like that, yeah.
So how does this work with mining pools? Say I want to join a Chinese mining pool here in Berkeley.
Yep. So I've never like joined the mining pool. I've never done mining, but when you're doing a mining pool, like here's the like sort of main Bitcoin network is like over here, and there'll be like there'll be a mining pool server. Let's say that this is a mining pool in China, and then there's all these like client nodes. So unlike the nodes over here, which are like full Bitcoin nodes participating in the network, these are just sort of little follower nodes. Let's see.
So they run lightweight clients?
No, they don't even need to run clients at all. So they'll just get the data that needs to be hashed and just do that calculation over and over again. So, but this is the full node that's participating in the network. So that's the node that must determine whether or not the data is valid according to the rules of the network. and then it'll be like, okay, cool, this is valid, and it'll farm out hashing to those mining pool participants, basically.
But it's probably not in your best interest to do that, right? Considering
Well,
it's so...
It depends what you are after. So the reason that people join mining pools is, so the current Bitcoin block reward is 12.5 coins, I think. So that's like, if at current bloodbath prices, that's like $30,000. So I could like get an ant miner, which is like a piece of Bitcoin hardware, mining hardware, and like plug it in at home and run it and try to like get some Bitcoins. The thing is that I would find a block probably like on average once like a year or like 2 years or like 3 years because there's so much hashing power in the network. So I might be able to break even that way, but my variance would be really high. Like maybe I'd go a whole year without finding a block. And then next block in the first week, I'd be like, oh, like next year in the first week, I'd find like 8 blocks, which would fuck me really hard for my taxes, which would be no good. So what people do is they join a mining pool where they contribute hashing power to the mining pool, and they get their like proportional slice of the mining pool's revenue. And because the mining pool is finding blocks relatively regularly, because that has a lot of hashing power, that means that they're getting paid out at a much more predictable rate. You know, so instead of getting $50 a year, you would get like $1.10 a month or whatever. That doesn't add up at all, but you know, $50 divided by 12 months.
But don't you still have this latency problem you mentioned before? Because say I'm one of these clients, and say, and one of the other clients finds the answer, transmits it to the server makes that block, but some of the other clients haven't received response from the server of the new UTXO set to work on.
So there is a latency problem. Like obviously there is latency between the connections here, but they don't have to transmit the full block between the mining pool and the mining pool participants. The size of, they only have to, like, so let me just, this will be useful later. So this is what a Bitcoin block really looks like when you put it on a whiteboard. So there's the block header. And then there's like some junk. And then there's a TX root, which is the root of all of the transactions. So I forget how much this is, but it's like, it's less than a kilobyte, I think. It's not a lot of data. But this is like the root of a larger structure, which is called a Merkle tree. And so that's like a tree of hashes. So this data and this data can be transmitted separately. And this data doesn't need to be transmitted to the mining pool participants. And this is the data which is getting bigger when we increase the block size. So the block header, even if we make let's say we jacked up the block size to like a gigabyte, it's this tree of transactions that would become a gigabyte. This block header size would stay the same. So although we would like to decrease, although it is in the mining participants' interest to decrease latency, it's not really, it doesn't factor into the block size sort of issue because they don't have to get the block size. It's only full nodes on the network that need to transmit the blocks between each other.
What's stopping the mining pool participants from using the solutions that they find themselves to get the full reward rather than just part of it?
That's an excellent question. I do not know the details of that, but I know that they're not able to do that. I don't know the details of how they're able to do that. Does anybody know?
The Coinbase transaction belongs to the pool, right? Not to the individual miner.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Like, okay, so the first transaction, this one, in every block, is very special. It's the Coinbase transaction.
That sends the 4.5.
Yes. Yep. So the mining pool, when it creates the block header, will have arranged all the transactions into the tree. They will have set the Coinbase transaction, and then you only get the block header to work on. You can't like hash your own header. Yep.
Each of these leads on the tree, those are specific transactions in that.
These leaves on this tree?
Yeah.
Yep, those are all transactions. And so this could be like arbitrarily high. It forks into every tier, but there can be any number of tiers. Cool. So yeah, incentivizes increased block size, increased block latency, less security for the network because more wasted hashing power, and incentivizes miners to be closer together on the network. So another important thing is that not all bytes in a block have the same resource cost. They're not all as expensive to process and store. So we talked before about the UTXO set, which is the set of unspent transaction outputs. So you've got to keep that in memory, and RAM is expensive and limited. So anything that bytes that create new transactions are more expensive, which will create new entries in the UTXO set and expand the size of the UTXO set. Those bytes are sort of more expensive than bytes that remove things from the UTXO set. So, as an example, transactions should take sort of other transactions as inputs and have some number of outputs that can be consumed by later transactions. So if you have a transaction that looks like this, right? It's taking a lot of inputs and only creating one output. That's actually going to decrease the size of the UTXO set because all this stuff, all these transactions can be taken out of the UTXO set, whereas you only need to put one output, one new output into the UTXO set. So this kind of like, and the thing that lets you, like the bytes over here, I don't know if I should get into this, it's like a bit later. Yeah, it is, okay. The thing that lets you take things out of the UTXO set, the thing that authorizes the spending of an output is the digital signature. And I'll use the term digital signature, witness, and witness data probably interchangeably. They just mean the same thing. So each one of these, I can't draw it all. Is this a key? It's kind of a key, right? Each one of these is going to have a little signature attached to it that says, this transaction is good to spend this transaction output, right? So given that the things on this side authorize spending transactions, that means that all these signatures, even though there might be a lot of bytes, they decrease the size of the UTXO set, so they're kind of cheaper. And the other nice property of signatures is that you get a transaction, you verify the signatures, and then you never look at a transaction ever again. You can just drop it on the floor. You do need to, new nodes, when they come online, they'll need to see all the transactions since the beginning to sort of like trust that there was no funny business. But that can be, you know, you can serve that off of disk or something. It doesn't have the same speed requirements as the UTXO set, basically. Yep. So if we just did a like very simple block size increase where you said, all right, 4 megabyte blocks, it doesn't really take into account the fact that these different bytes of those 4 megabytes take different amounts of resources to process and store. So transactions, miners, because the block size is simply limited to 1 million blocks, miners will prefer transactions that pay a high fee rate per byte. However, we would like it if they preferred a high fee rate per high expensive byte and not a super high fee rate per cheap byte, which is signature data. Cool. Yes.
What does UTXO stand for?
Unspent transaction output set. So this is a transaction. On this side are the inputs, and on this side are the outputs. So if this transaction has just hit the blockchain, that means that this output is waiting to be spent. It is an unspent transaction output. So the UTXO set is a set of those outputs that are like waiting to be spent.
Wait, can you repeat that about the fee rate?
Yeah, so fees are one Bitcoin is divided into 100 million Satoshis. That's like the tiniest amount of Bitcoin that the software can currently handle. And so fees are usually calculated in Satoshis per byte, right? Because the miner doesn't really care what the transaction, the fee of the transaction is on its own. It cares about the fee of the transaction and the size of the transaction. Because let's say you create a monster transaction that pays a relatively high fee, and the miner can only include that one transaction in the block. It might be preferable to have a bunch of smaller transactions that pay a smaller fee each, but pay a higher fee rate in Satoshis per byte, right, making them more lucrative to mine. Yeah. Does that make sense? No, it's
No, it's just, I'm gonna have to replay it in my head again.
yeah, it's a lot of, like, don't worry, like, it's like a lot of stuff. And also one thing I recommend is that, like, the beginning, like Satoshi's original white paper, it's actually not that bad. Like, compared to the completely insane, like, 75-page white papers that you see today, like, Satoshi's was like 8 pages, like, pretty, like, not simple. I'm not gonna say that it's simple, but it didn't have like a whole lot of machinery in it. So if you understand it and you understand a few concepts, you can understand Bitcoin.
So that kind of just regurgitate you, from my understanding too. A transaction will have more bytes in it if it involves more addresses in the transaction.
Yeah, because a transaction can have any number of inputs or any number of outputs, and so those addresses are sort of what, like, if it's spending. It's hard to use the really precise terminology, so I'm not going to be super precise. But yeah, if a transaction is spending from a bunch of addresses and like creating a bunch of new addresses, spending to a bunch of different addresses, then it's going to have a lot of bytes in it because it's going to have to encode all these inputs and all these outputs. Cool. All right. So this is like probably not super interesting, but I wanted to cover it anyways. So there's a current, I don't want to call it a bug, but like a vulnerability in Bitcoin called quadratic hashing. And it basically means that if you draw a graph of, let's see, size of block, and time to verify, as the size of the block, like what we'd like to see is we'd like to see a graph like this, where as the size of a block increases, the time to verify that block increases linearly. But due to the way that Bitcoin works, as the size of the block increases, it actually increases exponentially. So currently, which means that you could create like a monster block that would take a long time to verify. So currently, the 1 megabyte block size limits the size of blocks to 1 megabyte. And so that also limits the amount of time that you could, if you created like a maximally bad and hard to verify block, it also limits the amount of time it would take to verify that block. So, but if you just jacked up the block size to like 8 megs or 16 megs without fixing this vulnerability, you could produce a block that would take longer than the 10-minute average block time, which is like really bad. Yes?
Was this the original reason for a limit?
No, I don't think so. But just to reiterate, like you create this like a 16 megabyte block, it contains this crazy monster 15.5 megabyte transaction, and then it takes the nodes that receive it more than 10 minutes to verify it, which means that the miner that produced it would have a huge unfair advantage because like they could probably find a new block before anybody had even had a chance to verify this giant block. So I don't think so. I mean, like, I don't know, Satoshi is like obviously some kind of like crazy genius, so like I wouldn't put anything past him. But I don't think that Satoshi had this particular attack in mind. He could have. I think he probably was like, somebody could create a giant spam block, which would also take a long time to verify, and not necessarily take advantage of this quadratic hashing thing. which would be a particular arrangement of transactions.
Is this characteristic of all proof of work algorithms, or?
No, this is just like a detail. Yeah, this is just like a tiny detail. You could fix this, and that's sort of the reason why it's not super important, is that this can be fixed in other ways without changing any important properties of Bitcoin. But it does prevent a simple bump to the block size. All right. So this is like kind of controversial, but I think that some fee pressure is actually desirable. Some people are of the viewpoint that, you know, whatever amount of transactions there are, the block size should always be roughly larger than that, roughly able to accommodate all of the transactions that people want to send. So I think that that's wrong. So Bitcoin provides extremely durable, widely replicated storage. Like, at the end of the day, if you get your bytes into the blockchain, they are not going anywhere, because every node will keep it forever, and there are lots of nodes keeping it. So I think that whatever the block size, transaction volume will kind of grow to fill it. And having some limit to the block size prevents a huge volume of low-value transactions from bloating the blockchain. So I use quotes because this is obviously like super subjective. But Bitcoin is not really a substitute for like cloud storage or like S3, right? The cost metrics are just completely different. So it doesn't make sense to, and whenever something gets into the block size, it's got to be carried around by all nodes like forever, right? There's no getting rid of it, right? If you want to make sure that everything is kosher from the beginning of time, you need to verify all the data. That means keeping all the blocks, all the data ultimately that goes into blocks. So I think that that's, you know, it would be nice to put every transaction that could possibly, that people want to generate into the blockchain. But I think that ultimately it's just not practical. Yeah, and this is like, the reason this is really controversial is like, I think a lot of people would call me like a, you know, running dog of like small blockers or something for this. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, and so I'm also really paranoid about the increased resources needed to run Bitcoin, making it more vulnerable to attack. And people talk about like a 51% attack, or, you know, some miner with some like bad strategy or whatever damaging Bitcoin. Like, cryptocurrencies are small now, but they could challenge the legacy monetary and financial system. And we're talking about extremely powerful actors with essentially unlimited resources. And if they tried to, with unlimited resources to spend on attacking Bitcoin, and sort of the more nimble it is, the more difficult it is going to be to attack and destroy. So if the block size and the resources required to run a full node mean that you can only run them in a data center on like server class hardware, that's a much easier Bitcoin to attack than one which can be run out of some like bunker somewhere on like Raspberry Pis on like a 56K dial-up connection. Yeah, and I think, and I mean, like, we haven't seen this yet. And so I think right now a lot of people are like, you know, Bitcoin's great, like nobody could ever destroy it, we'll be fine. But it's like, we're talking about the government, right? The government that was like, you know, the US government that was like, let's invent the atomic bomb, which cost like maybe like $30 million to do, $30 billion, right, of like today's money, right? So if they had $30 billion to throw on, yeah, Bitcoin would be like not in good shape. So keeping it nimble and difficult to attack is probably a good idea. Cool. So I'm getting into this thing called transaction malleability, which is kind of a technical detail, but it's one of the prime motivations for segregated witness, and why segregated witness isn't just a simple bump to the block size. So every transaction has an ID. An ID is just some string of numbers, and it's you get the ID by taking the transaction data and just kind of putting it through this meat grinder, which is the SHA-256 hash function. So if you change one bit of the input data, the output of SHA-256, or the transaction ID, will be completely different, basically. And currently, and like thanks to this website, who I ripped this graphic off of, currently you have some inputs, some signature, and some outputs, and all of that goes into the transaction, right? So if you're able to change any part of this data, then you can change the transaction ID. And it turns out that signatures are malleable. So basically you can change a signature without affecting the validity of the transaction, but it will change the transaction ID. And you can even do this if you don't have access to the private keys. So you could have a network that looked like this, with like, you know, some user, some other user, and some miner. And like, this user broadcasts a transaction that they think has this ID, or has this ID when they broadcast it. And this user then changes it using the malleability in the signatures, so it has a completely different ID. And then this miner includes it in a block. So this user can still detect that the transaction ultimately made it into a block. Like, it doesn't change what the transaction does, but it will have a different ID. And yeah.
These are the same TX IDs that you're showing in the Merkle tree here?
Oh, no. Oh, yes. Yeah, the base data is the transactions, but the TX IDs are sort of what they're referred to by in the Merkle tree. So yeah,
so the TX IDs are the hash value of all this stuff.
Yep, exactly. Yep. Okay. So this is really annoying because it complicates a lot of things. We might like to be able to write code that says, if transaction with ID 0x1234 makes it into the blockchain, do this, right? Or do some other things. Instead, we have to sort of look to see if the transaction's effects have occurred, instead of being able to do this very quick lookup by the transaction ID. So this complicates a lot of things. Specifically, it complicates hardware wallet implementations a lot. Hardware wallets are, you know, little dumb devices with very small amounts of processing power. They can't go look at the whole blockchain. They have to go like, okay, tell me, is this transaction ID in the blockchain? Okay, cool. And they can't really like go and look at the whole blockchain to see if the effects have taken place to determine if the transaction has gotten in with another ID. The other thing that it happens to complicate is this thing called the Lightning Network. The Lightning Network is a bit out of scope for this talk because it's like really complicated, but it's also super awesome. So the Lightning Network would give us, with some caveats, like real microtransactions, like 1 zillionth of a Bitcoin, no problem. Instant confirmation, and then crazy stuff like cross-chain atomic swaps, actually being able to trade, for example, Bitcoin for some Litecoin without having to trust the person who owns the Litecoin, right? Just being able to, what's that word for, like an alchemist, right? Just change gold into silver. Like, it's nutty. Yeah. So we definitely want to fix transaction malleability. Cool. Any questions?
Yeah. How computationally difficult is it to find that other signature that still works?
Not difficult at all. Yeah, you can just, like, I think with the digital signatures, like, you can invert one number and that's still valid because, that's how the equations work. Super simple.
So what happens to the previous transaction? Is that even taken into account anyway?
The way to think about it is to think that these transactions aren't really different, right? It's like if I had a sticker that said Frank, when my name's Casey, and like this is the person who gets into the blockchain. It's like, well, I still got into the blockchain. It just says Frank instead of
How
Casey.
would other miners identify it as the same?
So if this made it into the blockchain and then you tried to retransmit that transaction, they would go, this transaction is no longer valid. Or if they had already seen this transaction, they would have sort of updated the current, they would have sort of said, okay, these transactions are not compatible with each other. They wouldn't see that they were the same, but they would know that they were sort of trying to spend the same money. Because they would be spending, they would both be consuming the same input, so they can't really exist together.
This is kind of touching on, I was talking about physical centralization before.
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't there more discussion about changing the hashing algorithm?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there is a lot of discussion of changing the hashing algorithm. That's one thing that is, might happen, probably very, very unlikely in the coming months. But there's a lot of momentum behind SHA-256. It would be nice, it would kind of be nice if you didn't need special hardware, but that would be a huge step. It would cause a lot of disruption. I don't know when and if, and also like, there's weird things that might happen. So if you change it to a proof of work that couldn't be solved with specialized hardware, that was like, that CPUs were able to do it, you might get a whole bunch of botnets mining Bitcoin. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. Yeah, and so it's just like a huge, hairy, super complicated issue. I don't know if we've gotten there yet. I would kind of like to see a proof of work change, but it's like Twilight of the Gods. It's like, it would be chaos.
I mean, when you say chaos, is the fear mainly just that we'd end up with a true hard fork?
Yeah, I mean, I think
Is
so.
the idea here that people generally don't want there to be that much of a hard fork? If anything, it's like a minority fork and a majority fork.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like anytime you have some sort of really contentious change to a cryptocurrency, you have a chance for that cryptocurrency to kind of split in two. And nobody really wants that, right? I want there to be like one definite Bitcoin that everybody knows is like the one true Bitcoin, basically. And changing the proof of work, there would definitely be people who would be like, this is no longer Bitcoin, this won't stand. Yeah.
Is there any advantage to changing the transaction ID?
No, this is just something that you would do to to mess somebody up, to like confuse a node. It might actually be the reason that Mt. Gox was drained. So I think that, I mean, this is like speculation. I'm not sure if people know this for sure, but you could go like, hey, Mt. Gox, like you sent this transaction 0x1234 paying me 4 hours ago, and like it's not on the blockchain. So can you pay me again? And like Mt. Gox is incompetent, goes, yeah, you're right, that did make it in the transaction. This dead beef transaction made it in there, but like who knows what that is? And then they create a new transaction which pays you again. I don't know if this is like the exact attack, but it's like what could have happened, something similar. So if you know that a transaction will always have the same ID, it makes all the code simpler, like so much simpler. And it makes everything just work better and reduces the chance to create bugs. Yeah.
So can you take a step back and like, how do the keys still unlock or like validate the transaction if they're edited?
Oh yeah, so I mean so like I would think about it like this. So a key is just sort of like some solution to a math problem, right? And if you have something that's like 1 plus 5, that's kind of the same as like 2 plus 4, right? In some sense, if you're looking to the answer for like what adds up to 6, these both solve those both produce the answer that you're looking for. They just have a different format. I think one of them specifically is that you can take in like an ECDSA signature, you can take one particular number, and invert it, just multiply it by -1, and it winds up producing the same result or being equally valid. Signatures are very complicated, so there's a lot of opportunity. The schemes are often very complicated, so a lot of opportunity to do things in different ways and sort of produce the same outcome.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So we definitely want to fix transaction malleability. So this brings us to segregated witness. Okay. which also known as SegWit, known as segregated witness because the witness data, or signatures are also called witness data because they witness the validity of the transaction. Okay, so basically what SegWit does is it takes a transaction and some amount of that transaction is signature data. And it just moves it out of the transaction. This is what you're like, yeah, okay, got it, Casey. So boring. So you can think about the data that's the non-signature data as being the effects of the transaction. So it takes the signature data and it puts it in a different part of the block. And I'll get to exactly how that's done in a second. But that's basically the whole thing in a nutshell. So crucially, it means that now the signatures no longer contribute to the transaction ID. The signatures have been moved to this magical place over here, and this stuff, the transaction effects, you can't malleate that. You can't modify that in the same way that you can modify transactions. So that means that a third party can't maliciously produce a new transaction ID when they see a transaction. Make sense? Okay, cool. So, oh yeah, I guess I should draw this. So one consequence is that the new style transactions, when a node that hasn't been upgraded to SegWit sees these new style transactions, they basically look like anybody is allowed to spend them. And because they see this anybody can spend transaction, and because it's anybody can spend, it doesn't need a signature, they're like, okay, cool, I guess everything is fine, right? But the signature data is in a different part of the block, and the full nodes will go, okay, this is a SegWit transaction. Let me check the signature data and validate it as normal. Nothing will change for a SegWit node. Question? No? Okay. Okay, now let me actually draw the way that things are organized in the blockchain. Okay, so normally you have the block header. And that has some junk, and it has the TX root. And then you have sort of separate from the block, but still part of it when we talk about the block size. The TX root, and then all of these transactions. Actually, if I draw this side, you can just imagine that this tree is millions of tiers tall, and it's got a lot of transactions. Okay, so there's also this special transaction called the Coinbase transaction. So I'll call that TXC. And so what SegWit does is it constructs this additional tree. Let's call it the WX root. And it's constructed exactly the same as this tree, with a hash at the top and stuff at the bottom, except at the bottom, is all the witness data. So under SegWit, now all the signatures that were in this tree are moved into this tree. So that's how SegWit moves the witness data into a new place. So the issue is you've got to like put this root somewhere in the block. And so this is the reason why people talk about SegWit as being like kind of a hack. But like kind of like everything's kind of a hack. Like trust me, like once you open up anything or like look at any code, like it's disgusting. So like don't let this distress you. So what SegWit does is it takes the Coinbase transaction and it sticks the WX root inside of that transaction. So there's the block header with the TX root that points to all the transactions. If you go down to the Coinbase transaction, you go into the Coinbase transaction, and that contains the WX root. I'll just draw a little line pointing. And so that's how you get this into the blockchain, into the block. So it's in a place where old nodes will ignore it. They'll just be like, whatever. But new nodes will find this structure, transfer this data amongst themselves, get all the witnesses, and then use them to verify the transactions exactly as before. Does that make sense? Cool. Let's see. So this gives us a really good opportunity. So because we're able to take all this transaction data, all this data that was in the block before, and put it into a place where old nodes can't see it, we can use it to effectively increase the block size. So old nodes see this, and this is still limited to 1 megabyte. So old nodes will still see the same world that they've always seen. They'll still see the same 1 megabyte limit. But new nodes will see this additional part of the block. And now we can increase the block size by allowing this to have, by giving some other limit to this data. And so it turns out that signatures actually make up a lot of the blockchain. If you replay the blockchain from scratch, signatures are about 60%. So that means that by moving them out from under this 1 megabyte limit, we can effectively increase capacity a great deal. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay, yeah?
So like about 2.5 megabytes?
So I think it winds up being about 2.1 megabytes in practice. I'll get into the actual weighting because it's like kind of weird, like everything is. But I think it's like 2.1 megabytes in practice. So cool, fixes transaction malleability. Let's see. Yeah, and also because we talked about this, like some bytes are more expensive or more costly than other bytes. Because we have this different limit for all this witness or signature data, we can weight it differently than this data. So for example, we could keep this data to 1 megabyte, but allow 1 million megabytes of signatures. Like not a good idea, but we could do that, essentially making signatures free, right? Which is good, I mean not 1 million megabytes, but good to make them cheaper because they're less costly. And in fact can save us resources in the long run because they spend things out of the UTXO set. That make sense? Cool. Okay, so this brings us to the block weight formula, which is complicated. I got it wrong like twice before I finally understood it, but it's kind of good to understand because this is what will replace the block size weight, or the block size. So currently we have a 100 byte block size. So that will be replaced with a 4,000 unit block weight limit. So we've gone from bytes to weight units, which are the sort of like abstract thing that we're gonna calculate in a second. So the new block weight is calculated as the base size, which is what old nodes can see. This is the base Okay. So the base data is just the old style data, and the total data is the old style data plus the SegWit data together. Yes?
Why 3?
Oh yeah, so it just makes the math work out. So let's just go through an example. So if you have 1 byte base size and 1 byte total size, that would mean that you didn't have any witness data, okay? No witness data, and you've got a megabyte of this stuff. So that means that the base size and the total size are the same. So then you got 1 million byte base size, 1 million byte total size, 1 million times 3 plus 1 million, per the formula here, is 4,000 weight units. So that's...
Yeah, my question is why 3?
Oh, well, it's just like the discount weight. So if the weight was... Oh, God, I'd have to think about it, but let's see. So if you increase 3, you would be penalizing base data. If you increase 3. Yeah, so the number here determines the sort of the exchange rate between base data and total data. So if it's very high, then that means that you can only put a little base data in, but you can put a lot of total data in. So it increases the discount for witness data. If it's very low, then it's essentially doesn't increase the discount for witness data. It's just, this is how much do you want to increase it. It's not like a number that you could derive. It's just from sort of observe, like what do signatures cost, like how do we want to align things. Yeah. So, and then in a SegWit block with 5 megabytes of base block data, so that's like 1 megabyte of this base, half a mega of this base stuff, and then 1 megabyte of witness data, so this extra stuff. So the total of the block is 1.5 megabytes. This is a block that is larger than would be accepted by current nodes. We do the same calculation, base size times 3 plus the total size. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. Plus the total size, and we get 3.5 million weight units. So this is this is Byzantine, but it's basically just amounts to how do you weight witness data versus old style data, and how do you make sure that the total of the old style data is always less than the current 1 megabyte block size, so that old style nodes never complain, basically. Okay. And it's just based on sort of observation of what costs what. Cool. SegWit additionally, oh yeah, and so this means that if we have this like weird pathological case where it's all witness data, we could see a 4 megabyte block, but in reality we're likely to see a 2.1 megabyte blocks on average. And this is like looking at the data that's in the blockchain right now. Yep.
Compare over this. You said 2 million.
Oh yeah, because this is the
That's the amount of signature data.
yeah, that's the signature data.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
So
this
two.
yeah, this should say witness size instead of total size.
Gotcha. Because there's like 1 MB of witness.
Or it should say 2 in total size. Yeah. Yeah. So this is a block with 0.5 megs of this is correct. This is wait, where did I make the error?
Just the 1.5 and the 2 don't match. It could be 1.5 also. It'd just be 3 million total weight units at the end of that example.
Yeah, that's
But
right.
it's just it's either 2 million total or 1.5.
Not important.
Math is hard. Even if it's like arithmetic. So this is really important to keep in mind. It's a doubling of the block size. A lot of people are trying to spin it like this isn't like the real data, but don't listen to them. It's a doubling. SegWit additionally does this really nice thing that it adds a version number to signatures. This is really great because it means that we can introduce new kinds of signatures very easily. In particular, there's a kind of signature called Schnorr signatures that are really, really good. They're faster to verify. You can take multiple signatures and like mush them together which is really good. So that directly increases scalability. And it incentivizes people to use mixers. So when people are sending their coins to a mixing service, and if people are actually incentivized to use mixers, everybody's mixing their coins and everybody has better privacy. And so this is an estimated 40% capacity on top of the SegWit increase. So this is not also like, this is not like moon technology, like this is not like crazy stuff. This is like very well understood, pretty simple upgrade to the system. So not something that will take like zillions of years to roll out. And then if people switch to short signatures, which they should because there's no downside, then we would have 3 megabyte blocks. So this isn't in SegWit, but SegWit gives us the capability to do this very easily. Cool. All right, so SegWit, the current SegWit deployment is called BIP 141. BIP stands for Bitcoin Improvement Proposal, and the 141 describes the current SegWit proposal, and it describes how it's rolled out. It uses a method described in a BIP called BIP 9. So basically, it has a chance to activate every 2016 blocks. This period, it's not any 2016 blocks, it coincides with the difficulty adjustment period. So every 2016 blocks, Bitcoin already adjusts its difficulty. So in those same windows, SegWit has a chance to activate. 2016 blocks is approximately 2 weeks. So if 95% of blocks signal during that period, SegWit is locked in. And then an additional 2-week period passes after lock-in, at which point SegWit activates. So this signaling is done by miners when they find a block. Either this block contains a bit which says like yay SegWit, or it doesn't. And that's, yeah.
Why 95%? I mean, that just seems so high.
Yeah, so like SegWit was not supposed to be like this contentious issue. I think SegWit is really good. I think SegWit is a great set of improvements. And I think the devs who rolled it out sort of felt the same. And so they didn't think, like, obviously 95% block signaling means 5% of miners have the chance to sort of veto it if they want to. And I just don't think that they thought that there would be this, like, veto.
Why not just, like, propose another BIP that drops the 95 to... There is another BIP.
Oh. Yeah, there is. Yeah, we're going to get to that. Like, this is like pre, like, the madness. The madness is coming in a few slides. So, like, okay, so arguments for SegWit. Did I get everything? Yeah, and it expires if not activated within 2 years. The current deployment started in November 2015, so we're coming up on the 2-year expiration date. I think it's mid-November 2017. Cool. So why is SegWit good? So it's a soft fork. You sort of fool old nodes, so you don't have this like hard fork at which the whole network needs to upgrade or people get left behind. So that's good. Aligns incentive with resource costs. Allows on-chain scaling improvements. So specifically, I'm talking about Schnorr here, Schnorr signatures, and paves the way for layer 2 scaling improvements. So layer 2 scaling improvements are things like the Lightning Network, which aren't directly on Bitcoin, but are built on top of Bitcoin, so there's sort of a layer above it. So SegWit makes it easy to roll it. And then this is like way like inside baseball, but it disables this thing called covert ASIC boost. ASIC boost is a technique that makes your mining chips more efficient, and completely accidentally, SegWit disables it so you can't do it on the sly. Basically, there's 2 ways to do it. There's a covert way where nobody knows that you're using ASIC boost, and there's an overt way where anybody can look at the blocks and see that you're using ASIC boost. So completely accidentally, not part of its design. Yeah.
Why would you want to hide it?
Oh, I mean, it's kind of controversial. It's like there's patents covering it. It's like if I knew that a bunch of miners, if it was obvious that a bunch of miners were using ASIC boost, it would be disabled through other means, like immediately, I think. And it's not like it would take a lot. It would just, you know, slightly reorganize the data in the block header, something like that. Yeah, I think it would just be killed immediately. It's hugely profitable if you can use it. So if I was a miner and I was using covert ASIC boost, I would want to use it for as long as possible, and I want to keep people from finding out that I was using it. So SegWit happens to disable that. If you're curious why, it's to do covert ASIC boost, you kind of need to manipulate the structure of the block header. And because you've got to put this witness tree root in the Coinbase transaction, you're no longer able to manipulate the block header that way. And there's this other thing in the block called inversion, which is basically just the block version. It's used for a variety of things. So if you wanted to do overt ASIC boost, which you can still do after SegWit, you've got to flip a bunch of bits in this to get hashing to like line up how you want. But everybody's going to see that there's this random garbage in your end version, and so they're going to know that you're using this boost like immediately.
What miners are against SegWit?
I try to like, you know, I don't know what, like I can't see inside of anybody's head, so I really try to avoid like being like, you know, fucking Bitman and Jihan using their ASIC boost. But yes, were a miner using ASIC boost, like then they would probably not want to see this roll out. I don't know which miners are. I don't know how much their money they're making off of it. I don't know like what the incentives are. But yes, that's totally yes. Cool. Arguments against SegWit. Soft fork is hacky. I'm like, whatever, everything is hacky. Soft fork means users must opt out to retain the status quo. This is like kind of valid. It's like if you want Bitcoin to remain the same, if it's a soft fork, you're not really your nodes aren't gonna tell that there's a difference, and so you've actually got to upgrade them or hard fork in order to get out. So this is more sort of a philosophical thing. I don't really buy it as an argument because I think SegWit is good for all users. So even though these, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure if all that and at a high level still don't understand the difference between hard fork and soft fork.
Yeah. So yeah, so a hard fork, let's do this. A soft fork is a tightening of the rules. So things that were valid are no longer valid. Okay? So old nodes will have sort of a more generous definition of what is Bitcoin, and new nodes will have a sort of tighter definition of what is Bitcoin. Assuming that the miners upgrade and the soft fork happens, that means that all the new blocks that are produced will follow this new tighter set of rules for Bitcoin. And so that new tighter set of rules falls into the old, looser set of rules of the unupgraded nodes.
Oh, so it's like you sketched here where the old nodes will still be
Yeah,
able to operate with the new ones.
Yeah, the old nodes are like, what's this weird data in here? Who cares?
Okay.
You know? Yeah. Whereas the new nodes will be following that data and making sure that it's valid, right? The new rules include this additional restriction that the witness data must be validated, basically, right? Whereas you've kind of fooled the old nodes. The old nodes are sort of, they don't care about the witness data, but they'll go along with it without being upgraded. A hard fork.
So then doesn't that mean that your network is only as secure as the number of new nodes?
Not really. It's kind of secure according to what the miners are doing and the amount of upgraded hash power. So miners won't produce old style blocks. Miners will all upgrade. You could temporarily fool the old nodes with an invalid block, but you would lose a ton of money because that block would be rejected by all the other nodes, basically. So it's not much of an attack vector. A hard fork is something that when old nodes see it, they'll be like, that's totally invalid. And so they'll like reject those blocks and it'll effectively partition the network. There'll be new nodes on one side, old nodes on another side, and they'll no longer be speaking to each other. Yeah. People say that the way that old nodes see it as anyone can spend transactions or some kind of attack vector, like they're not. Like all the nodes are going to be upgraded. The chances to fool an old node are extremely limited because nodes don't just like take nodes don't. When a node sees a potentially valid transaction, it doesn't just immediately accept it. Nobody, makes a Bitcoin exchange where they'll pay out money on a transaction they've seen that hasn't been into a block. So miners will be enforcing these new rules, and it means that it's not really possible to fool nodes, even old nodes, with these anyone can spend transactions that appear to be anyone can spend transactions. Yep.
So with the soft fork, there's no, the network won't split and there won't be two different coins, right?
That's right.
And that's what SegWit's going for in the soft fork?
That's what the SegWit, like the current deployment that's been going for like in progress for like a year and a half, basically. Yeah.
Okay.
There's the argument that it's unfair to non-SegWit transactions, because even if you're using an old node sending old style transactions, you still get more space in the base block if other people are using SegWit and their data is moved out of the base block. And there's this really like subtle point here that it further incentivizes this problem called validationless mining. I will try to link to that after the presentation, but it's kind of an interesting, it's really interesting because it is kind of a valid criticism. It doesn't really, it affects, it's not like very likely, and there's a super easy fix. So those are the arguments against SegWit. It's hard for me to present a really unbiased, super unbiased view, obviously, because I was like, look at these arguments, they're garbage. But it's what I believe, and I'd be super happy to take any questions that anybody has.
What does it look like to upgrade a node?
Just
upgrade, or is it new hardware?
No. It's everything. Everything works exactly the same way. You go from Bitcoin 0.13.0, which was the last version that couldn't use SegWit on mainnet, and you upgrade to 0.13.1. That's the first version that understands activation. Then you're good to go. Cool. Yeah.
What are the deadlines for SegWit again? Or when is it being proposed?
Yeah, so the current rollout, what I'll call the BIP 141 rollout, started in November of 2015. Every 2 weeks, chance to activate SegWit expires November 2017.
So since then, it hasn't been activated?
Nope. It's got 15%, and then people seized upon it as this political football, and then it's hovered, and now there's chaos.
What does it mean for a block to signal?
Oh yeah, basically this N version thing, in addition to being used in overt ASIC boost, it also has space to vote for, or I like to use the word signal because it's less political, to signal for readiness for a soft fork upgrade.
Okay. Basically. And that's been built in since the beginning.
It got basically. Yeah. It works slightly different than it did initially. Now you can have multiple potential soft forks in flight at the same time when that didn't used to be possible. But yeah, basically you set a bit, you signal for a soft fork.
There's another date, first
Yes, this is the chaos that I'm going to get into. Cool. Oh yeah, so we're getting long time. So these are more opinions. So I think that a 2x or a 10x block size increase doesn't really do much to enable fundamentally new use cases. But Lightning Network, something like Lightning Network actually does. Lightning Network is potentially zillions of transactions per second, microtransactions, crazy stuff, people actually using Bitcoin in new ways. So I think that, I'd like to see that pursued before just jumping on a block size increase. Another thing is that it's always a good idea to have efficiency before capacity. It's like a bridge, and the rule is the bridge can only survive if you drive a 1-ton truck over it. And you've got a truck that's 999 pounds of steel and one tiny 1-pound bucket of strawberries, right? It's it's probably a good idea to put more strawberries and like less metal on the truck than to try to like increase the size of the bridge. And that's sort of Schnorr signatures. Like pursue these efficiency increases before you try to scale the raw capacity of the system. Bitcoin and Raspberry Pis. This is my like tinfoil hat. Like government, come to get us. Let's keep it running on our Raspberry Pis. These other things that invertible Bloom lookup tables and then things that are called weak, thin, or soft blocks. These are basically ways to deal with the latency issue. We should wait for that. I don't know what. This is just a rogue bullet point block size increase. I don't know. And then centralization has momentum. So if you take a bunch of entities that are like currently participating in Bitcoin, and you sort of have like over here you have, and it's like some sort of like bell curve, right? And over here you have like Raspberry Pis. If, in case anybody's not familiar, a Raspberry Pi is like a super tiny, like $20 computer that you can buy on Amazon. They're rad. But they're like super anemic and underpowered. And then over here you have data centers. So if you change the resource requirements of running Bitcoin to push out the lower resource entities, it'll start looking like this, right? And the entities, oh yeah, I should have done this before I did this. So this is like where everybody is sort of okay, the like average resource requirements that people are sort of okay with needing to run Bitcoin. So if you push all these like tiny actors out, all of a sudden it's going to move the center of the people who are left like down here, right? And now these people are going to be more okay with centralization, and thus like continuing to increase the resource requirements will leave you with people who are more and more okay with centralization. So I'm nervous about that kind of centralization having momentum and driving us to non-Raspberry Pi running future. I don't actually really care if Raspberry Pis run Bitcoin. I do care if like you can only really run it in a data center. That would be really bad. Cool. Okay, so people have been really irritated. I don't know. Some people have been like, SegWit, that sucks. It's awful. It's a hack. It's unfair. Other people have been like, I want SegWit now. There's this thing called the user-activated soft fork. It was proposed in BIP 148 by internet person Shaolin Fry. Basically what it does is it says that on August 8th, all the nodes that are following BIP 148 will start ignoring blocks that don't signal for SegWit. So blocks are being found, and they're like SegWit yes, and then a block is found, and it's like SegWit no, and then this is August 1st. And a block which says SegWit no is found. So non-BIP 148 user-activated soft fork nodes will consider this node, this block, to be valid, right? All the nodes that are following BIP 148, on the other hand, will consider it to be invalid. And so if there's some amount of hash power mining on the BIP 148 chain, new blocks will be produced, and they'll only be recognized if SegWit is sort of voted for or signaled. So the effect of this is that even if this blockchain grows really, really, really slowly, and this is like zillions of blocks ahead, it will eventually activate SegWit because it will only consist of the blocks that signal for SegWit. Yeah, that's basically user-activated soft fork in a nutshell.
I'm not sure I understand how that's not a hard fork.
It's not a hard fork because they just ignore non-SegWit signaling nodes. So let's say that this, the sort of the old chain was growing more slowly, right? And let's keep at least one block there so this makes sense. So this is like a legacy chain, the non-user activated software chain. All the nodes would simply see the user activated software chain as the valid chain, right? They're valid blocks, valid under the old rules. The only difference is that all the 148 implementing nodes will ignore blocks that are not signaling SegWit. Yep. So yeah, this blockchain is still compatible with all nodes, although it's potentially shorter so that only the user activated software nodes are following it. Yeah.
What'll determine which one is longest?
How much hashing power is pointed to each chain?
So it's 50%.
No, I mean, so like if this chain has, 10%, then this chain will go at 10% of the speed, and this one will grow at 90% of the speed, basically. So there's a weird game theory thing, which is that this chain can be wiped out by this chain, but the reverse is not true. So let's say we were in this situation. There's 3 blocks on the user activated software fork, and there's 1 block on the other fork. All the nodes in the network would just forget about this block. They go oh, this is the real block, right? With a real chain, because it's longer, it's valid according to the rules. So anytime this chain gets larger than the other chain just vanishes. So the reverse is not true. Because user activated software nodes are programmed to ignore blocks that don't signal SegWit, even if this chain is longer, they'll see, they'll get to the point, they'll get to August 1st in the chain, they'll go to the next block, they'll go, no SegWit, they'll go, screw that. It's not valid, right? So this presents a risk to miners on this chain, that this chain might reorganize into this chain, but that the opposite isn't true. So I don't know how I feel about user activated software. I like SegWit, but it's pretty drastic. It's all right, let's nuke people. It would cause a lot of chaos, right, as these two chains are coexisting. There might be a lot of variance. So this chain getting faster, but then getting wiped out a few times before one sort of achieves dominance. So there's it introduces a lot of uncertainty. But it would get SegWit activated. So yeah, that's user activated software. Yeah.
Why do they call it user activated?
I think that it's I kind of like calling it BIP 148 because that's a more neutral thing.
Yeah.
The idea is that it's it's everybody's trying to paint their side as being, the side of the people, which is, that's what every dictator does, right? Or every, and so I don't know if this is a bad thing. I think it might be better than the status quo. I don't know. But that's the idea. It's we're the users. And one kind of thing is that it is something that full node operators do. So it doesn't require miner participation. The users can do this on their own. Whether or not it will be successful will depend on hash rate. But yeah, so it's kind of accurate because you don't need to be a miner to do it. But it's also just
if the miners don't come along, there's no hash power. So.
Yeah, then you wouldn't even be able to find enough blocks to get that SegWit activation.
All full nodes are turned on, all the users, so no miners on.
Yeah.
It goes nowhere.
Yeah, there's that game theory risk, right? That if there's any hashing power, miners might getting really nervous and bail on one side for the other.
What's it look like now? How's it looking?
Nobody knows. Because there's no, the chains haven't split. All the miners are still mining the same chain. We'll only know on August 1st if it comes to that. And it will be very uncertain because we won't know exactly how much hashing power is at each chain until a few blocks are found. And so we have sort of a relative idea of the risk. It's not like August 1st, 12:01 a.m., 51% on this, 49%. It's like it'll be a few hours before we know. I think you had a question first.
I was just going to say, why not SegWit 2x? Are there arguments, what are the arguments against that?
Well, let's stay on user activated software. Next slide is 2x.
if there's a lot less hashing power on the left chain, wouldn't the difficulty go down and then it would go faster?
Yes, so, but it needs to get to the first difficulty adjustment point before the activation period times out, before we hit November 15th. So it's expected that it'll slowly churn through one activation, difficulty would drop, and then maybe it'll have time before. And for reference, the magic number that this side needs to survive and activate SegWit before SegWit times out is 15%. That's not saying that at 15% this chain will win, just that this chain will activate the current SegWit deployment.
Are all the nodes on Greenwich Mean Time, or are they local time?
Yeah, I think Blockhead is probably UTC, like UTC. It's like Unix timestamp. It's like second since 1970.
So the way I look at it, so BIP 141 basically just introduces SegWit.
Mm-hmm.
This enforces SegWit.
Well, this says that like at a certain point we're going to ignore non-signaling blocks and thus forcing it to lock in. So yeah, kind of.
What's the added value to this?
Well, it's that you get SegWit sooner rather than later, maybe. This is a play to try to force the activation of SegWit. The goal here, I don't think, is well, it depends on who you talk to. But the goal here, I don't think, is to create two chains. I think the goal here is to get enough hashing power on this chain and get enough miners to defect so that SegWit activates and this chain wins, and there's no more this chain. There's no split.
Is this the New York proposal?
No. So user-activated soft fork, this is not the New York proposal. New York proposal is SegWit 2x.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if 95% of the people have already said that yes, SegWit is going to happen, of the miners that have said that SegWit is going to happen, what is like the likelihood of BIP 148 happening?
Well, so currently the rate at which miners have sort of said that have voted for the current SegWit deployment is way lower than 95%. The current percentage on chain is like 48%, maybe something like that.
So then, how was August 1st decided?
I think it was decided with an eye for how much time they would need before the end of the current deployment to have any hope of locking it in. Just sort of.
So August 1st is a prediction, not a sure shot that SegWit's going to happen.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and it's just like giving people enough time to coordinate in advance.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so next is SegWit 2x. So SegWit 2x is by Barry Silbert and the Digital Currency Group. It attempts to lock in the current BIP 9 SegWit deployment. I say BIP 9. BIP 9 is the activation method. BIP 141 is the current SegWit deployment. By doing the same orphaning thing that the user-activated soft fork does, right? It proposes to get SegWit to happen in the same way. However, 80% of miners vote for it first. Basically, you have a 2.3-day activation window. Those activation windows start ticking by, and if 80% of blocks in that activation window signal for SegWit 2x, not signal for SegWit, signal for SegWit 2x, then one window later, those nodes are all programmed to start ignoring blocks that don't signal for SegWit, basically. And it also includes provisions to hard fork to a 2 megabyte base block size, leading to an effective 4 megabyte block size 3 months after SegWit activates. So this is kind of weird. There's no way to actually make a hard fork conditional on a soft fork. To say once this hard fork goes through, or once this soft fork goes through, this hard fork will go through. There's no way to do that. But this is the like sort of stated and like political aims of the agreement, basically. God, okay, so yeah, 31 of 91. Oh my God. So these are some timeline slides. I'll just go through them really quickly. Okay, so Satoshi dumps 0.3.1 on the forums. It's got the block size limit. He's like, this is a bug fix maintenance release. No, it's not, Satoshi. And then let's see, April 28, 2011, Satoshi Disappear Day. I don't know why we don't call it this. This is like some forum post I found. This is when it was confirmed that like Satoshi was like not coming back. So the reason I have this slide is like maybe if Satoshi was around, he'd just tell us all what to do. We wouldn't be in this mess. But yeah, Satoshi disappeared. Okay, BIP 42. This is just laying out some of the problems with malleability. Nothing interesting here. Non-controversial. Yeah. Bitcoin XT, this is interesting because this is the first sort of alternate client release that sort of tried to challenge Bitcoin Core. Okay, now we get into the era of sort of people's different block size proposals. This is Jeff Garzik, dynamic maximum block size by miner vote. One way of doing things. This is Gavin Andreessen. I guess this is his. Yeah, this is his like bonkers. Immediate increase to 8 megabytes, doubling every 2 years for 20 years, which means a final block size of 8 gigabytes. I think this is a really bad idea. Then he's like, hey, Bitcoin Core, can we merge this? And I'm just like, no. Yeah. Again, remember, we're in like the KC bias zone now. Okay, so, and then, what is this? Oh yeah, then Jeff Garzik is like, can we do just 2 megabytes? And then Peter Woolley is like, well, maybe we should do, this is like clearly the one written by an engineer. It's like we should increase 4.4% every 97 days with an average of 17.7% per year. Like, why these numbers, Peter? Anyways, this is like pretty conservative. So, oops. Oh no. These images are all like 10 megs, so it takes okay, so then Bitcoin XT merges Gavin's 141 BIP, which was the eventually 8 gigabytes block. Then BIP 9 appears, which is like the SegWit rollout mechanism. And then in this IRC channel, they're like, holy shit, we could do SegWit as a software. So this is G. Maxwell, Greg Maxwell, damn, you're right, this is pretty cool. Smiley face from Luke Jr. thought of it as the software, so they're like cooking this up. And then this is Peter Woolley or Peter Wale, I think, publicly presenting the current version of SegWit as it exists now. He has a lot more facial hair now, so I like to call him Peter Woolley now. And then this is like the Bitcoin's core scaling roadmap that was published December 2015. Where Greg Maxwell is like, let's be really careful and let's do SegWit and then like Schnorr signatures and like maybe see it's okay. It's like Bitcoin Unlimited gets released. Bitcoin Unlimited, it doesn't have a BIP because it's like completely bonkers, but it's like, miners can vote. Like, cats living with dogs in sin, not a good idea. And then this is BIP 141 by Peter Woolley. Which is segregated witness as we know it today. This is December 21st, 2015. Segregated witness testnet is launched. What is this? Why is this in here? Oh yeah, this is Gavin going okay, no 8 gig blocks, but what about a one-time 2 meg block size increase? Bitcoin Classic gets released, including Gavin Andreessen's his 2 meg patch. Then we get to the Bitcoin Roundtable consensus thing. This is everybody who was in Hong Kong at the talks and watching Peter Woolley present, going all right, we all agreed on SegWit and then 2 meg hard fork, and it's it's complicated. But this is what a lot of people point to when they say the core devs agreed to it, when really it was some core dev members said a hard fork might be reasonable. Yeah, but then things got complicated. Finally, we get to August 23rd, 2016. Bitcoin Core 0.13 is released. This is the first version that has SegWit. It can't activate it on mainnet though. And then in the next version, 0.13.1, it actually can activate SegWit. So that's when this is the version of Bitcoin Core that had the SegWit code in it. So this is interesting. This is a BIP by Shaolin Fry before user-activated soft fork appeared, where he's sort of proposing an alternative method for maybe rolling out SegWit, which says miners can lock it in earlier than a certain time, but they can't veto it. This is sort of not super important, but whatever, it's there. And then, holy shit, user-activated soft fork, shall and fry, March 12, 2017. Yep.
This isn't exactly an important question, but it's bothering me.
Yeah.
Why are the numbers not sequential?
So what do you mean?
The bit numbers.
Oh yeah, bib numbers are like assigned randomly. They sort of, I mean not randomly, so they sort of have like themes. So like bips 100-ish were like block size bips. SegWit has a few related bips, those are all like 140-ish bips. I guess user-activated soft fork is also a 140-ish bip. Bips 8 and 9 are sort of process bips, so they're in that 10 range. So yeah, no good answer. Yeah, so this is user-activated soft fork. Holy fuck, this is like we're gonna nuke you. And it's important to notice that like a BIP just kind of means that a technical proposal has been brought forward, and it like kind of could. It's like not completely nuts. It doesn't mean that it like has been accepted or that it's been implemented. There are lots of BIPs that never made it into Bitcoin. Okay, so this is like the initial proposal for SegWit 2x. Then it was called SegWit 2 megabytes. It's like here, let's do SegWit plus 2 blocks, right? It's trying to align the people who want a giant block size increase or some block size increase with people who want SegWit, basically. It's like, it's just speaking as an engineer, it's like political horse trading, right? It's like the kind that you really don't want to see in a technical project, right? Where one party is like, I want this, one party is like, I want that, and instead of like figuring out what the right answer is, being like, all right, let's just do 50% of both of our ideas. And you have this weird like Frankenstein, right, wandering around the office, and everybody's like, holy shit, that was a terrible idea. It's a good idea to make decisions based on what makes sense, not based on what's like politically expedient. Anyways, end of bias zone. Back, this is appearance of SegWit 2x. This is interesting. So this is Shao and Fry's proposed activation of SegWit if the current activation fails using BIP 8, which was after BIP 9, which doesn't allow the minor veto. Okay, great. And then, what's this? Oh yeah, okay, and this is like the official like announcement of SegWit 2x. Activate SegWit, and then down here is like hard fork. What's this? That's in the slide. Whatever. Oh god, these are such detailed stuff. Oh yeah, so then so here's the interesting thing is that the first appearance of SegWit 2 megabytes wasn't going to be compatible with user-activated soft fork. It didn't like happen in a way that would guarantee that this chain split didn't happen. So then this like unsung hero guy, James Hillard, comes in and goes, okay, do SegWit 2x in a way that it won't cause, it'll activate SegWit before the user-activated soft fork. Good to point out. It's just like really smart to like actually, because otherwise it was like UASF might happen and SegWit 2x would be incompatible with it. So nobody wants that. Some updates. And then this is like Bitmain, like who's like the mining operation in China. This is like just pants on head stupid. They're like, we're gonna hard fork, and like not only are we're gonna hard fork, we're gonna have like weird rules if this side of the chain like looks like it's gonna survive. They're like, we're gonna hard fork, and we're gonna have our own blockchain with huge blocks and like terrible code. And that's June 14th, 2017. Any questions? Yes.
How much mining power do we have?
A lot. Yeah, nobody really knows how much because when you get to 51%, when you start getting there, people get a little nervous, so maybe you want to take your 50%, make it look like 25% over here, 25% over here. So, unclear.
So what was Bitmain's rationale, or like stated rationale?
Yeah, Bitmain is like, user-activated soft fork is like bad, SegWit is bad and unfair, it's like this hijacking of the protocol, so we're going to have a hard fork at this point. And they're calling it a user-activated hard fork, which user-activated soft fork, like, okay, this is debatable. This is like pure like politics. This is like propaganda. Like, yeah, Jihan, like user-activated hard fork, blog.bitmain.com. Like, come on. Yeah. Okay, so that brings us to the present day, July 13th, 2017. We've got this dumpster going real nice over here. Fortunately, there's a fire truck. I think it's going to be okay. So I stole a lot of this from this like nice graphic that Bitcoin Magazine put out that shows the dates. So we're like right here, which is why I'm really glad that I got to be able to give this talk at this time, because everything is like super topical and we don't know how things are going to turn out, which is terrifying, but also a little bit exciting. So July 14th, this is the day that BTC1, which is the software that implements SegWit 2x, is planning to be deployed. Not activated, just rolled out so that people can test it. I wanted to get into some of the weird interactions with like difficulty and user-activated software, but I'm like way over time, so I won't get into that. But it's interesting how user-activated software lines up with the difficulty adjustment. BIP91 signaling starts. This is the SegWit 2x nodes signaling that they're going to do SegWit 2x, July 21st. If they all signal right away and it gets activated in the first period, it will lock in at this time. It won't do anything yet, but it will guarantee that those nodes will do something. This is the earliest that we could see SegWit 2x be activated, July 25th. So this is the earliest that we could see not the user-activated soft fork, but the SegWit 2x nodes start to only accept SegWit signaling blocks, basically. This is more difficulty adjustment stuff. So this is the latest that SegWit 2x can lock in before it's able to prevent the split with the user-activated hard fork, right? Because if SegWit 2x happens before the user-activated hard fork, soft fork, all the blocks will be signaling SegWit, right? So we get to August 1st, there won't be this this block here that splits the network, because presumably if 80% of miners signal for it, 80% of miners will be on the side of the chain, so it will grow much faster. So this is when it needs to lock in. This is a sort of less interesting deadline. This is the deadline by which BIP 141, which is the current SegWit deployment, must lock in to prevent this whole mess. So this could actually happen without BIP 91. It's looking unlikely since it's floated around 45%. Then the next day, August 1st, everybody's favorite, user-activated soft fork might activate it. So this is Luke Jr. It's like the spiciest meme I could make. So like Luke Jr. is one of the core devs. He's like really controversial. He says some like way out there things. He's also like, yeah, fight for the Raspberry Pis, which I respect. So this is the date that the user-activated soft fork might activate, August 1st, which is like chaos. This is the date, August 1st, 2017, remember that Bitmain blog thing? Yeah.
So on that day though, because 45% already kind of supporting it, but Bitmain has said they'll hard fork.
Well, no. So if SegWit 2x succeeds in heading off the user-activated soft fork split, then Bitmain will not do their weird.
So Bitmain is mainly angry about the soft fork rather than some of the improvements.
It's really unclear. Okay. So the thing about like, and it's unclear why Bitmain would agree to the SegWit 2x agreement. My feeling is that it's kind of like an attempt to save face. You know, they're like, yeah, we'll do SegWit, but you guarantee a block size increase. Instead of just sort of having to capitulate.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I'm not sure though, and this is like, it's really hard to know why. Another theory is that they want to do SegWit 2x to stall before the user-activated soft fork and like possibly like create more uncertainty and maybe cause it not to happen. I don't know. I really don't know. Like, there's a possibility that somehow not 80% of nodes signal for BIP 91. even though they're expected to, even though they've indicated that they're going to. Maybe they don't, and then like it's like an attempt to just sort of throw off user-activated software. Things get really weird because it's like move and counter move and all sorts of stuff like that. Yep.
In general, what do proposals need to activate again? Do they always need 95% agreement?
You know, they're just different activation thresholds. So 95% is really conservative. Sometimes things have activated in the past with a simple flag day. Like, all right, 2 years from now, everybody's gonna have to upgrade, and then everybody just does it. Yeah. So it's just like variety of techniques, basically. Sometimes Satoshi just rolled things out. Okay. So Bitcoin ABC hard fork. Bitcoin ABC is the name of the software that Bitmain has like pledged to mine. Begins mining. At first, they'll mine it in private. This is if the user-activated hard fork happens. And then a few days later, they will release it. This will be a disaster. Like,